So I am in a directory right now, and if I look at the list of what's in here, I have a node modules here, node modules folder, but nothing else. And that's because I didn't want you to sit here and watch me install my node modules for the demo. That's all that is. I created a project, deleted everything but the node modules, and we're going to create it again now. Now that we have that out of the way, I will create my project. So I have the Power Apps component CLI installed, and that pack is a Power Apps CLI. We didn't make you do that. And if I just hit enter, you can see all the different things that it can do right now. It's grown as time has gone on. We can package everything up. We can create plugins. We can work with our organization. We can set up authentication and so on. I've already set up authentication against my environment, but I'm going to be doing everything locally in this demo anyway. So what we want to do, and I will just clear this out, is create a new project. So I will run pack pcf init, and if you're like me, you'll forget what all the parameters are. So I usually do. So I'll just hit enter. It's going to tell you all this stuff is missing. That's okay. So we'll give it first we need to give it a namespace. The namespace will keep these controls from colliding with each other if somebody else pushes a control with the same name. I will just call it demos. We have to give it a name. And for today, we'll just go with hello world. And the template can be either field or a data set. I'm going to pick field. Again, if you're going to be dealing with like a table of data in one particular property, like items, you might see a lot of controls with items in Canvas apps. You use a data set template, but we're going to stick with field for today. That'll create that project. And if I just rerun that again, we can see everything is there. So now I will run Visual Studio Code to pull that up. All right, and drink some water real quick. All right, so we have some basic stuff right here in the root of our folder here. We have our TypeScript configuration file that is inheriting from one of our node modules for a base configuration that we give you, but you could remove this and just set all the TypeScript options yourself. If you wanted to do that, you're certainly allowed. We have a Pcf config file that just controls the output directory of where we output our output when we're building everything. Generally, you can leave this alone, but if you have a reason that you want to change it, that's where you would. And our package JSON file, at the end of the day, a PCF component is built on top of that, the modern web stuff, including NPM. And every package that you create is going to have, or every control you create is going to have a package JSON file. So you can see that we are pulling in the types for the Power Apps component framework, but we're not pulling in the Power Apps component framework itself. And that's because we don't actually ship the framework as a separate thing you need to download or a separate thing you need to install. The framework is going to be there as part of the product, whether you're talking to Canvas Power Apps, if you're talking to model-based Power Apps, or even Dynamics 365, we make sure that the framework is there where you're going to be running your code to make sure that you don't need to worry about that. What we do send out separately are the TypeScript types for the framework so that you can code against it and make sure that all the code you're writing is good before you push it up to your environment. We have some dev dependencies. These are the node modules that we have that build the PCF controls and manage that kind of local debug harness website. And if you go, there's standard kind of commands for building and cleaning and so on. We have our PCF project file that if you've ever cracked open a project file from a Visual Studio project, it looks an awful lot like this. This is our version of it. Generally, you don't ever want to mess with this unless you know what you're doing and integrating it maybe with a larger build process. Today, we are not going to touch that, and that'll be it. And just a get ignore file for the basic stuff we don't want to keep checking in, like our output folder and so on. So node modules, it's a mile long, it's node modules. And hello world, this is our folder that we actually created with all our files for our particular project. Let's start off here by looking at this control manifest input file. This is going to be the XML file, that manifest file that I told you about, that controls, the well, how the control represents itself inside the environment. We'll walk through, there's a lot going on here. I'm just going to maybe put this on a separate line so we can see it all. So we have our namespace that we defined when we first created demos, our constructor, which is the name of the control in code, in this case, hello world with no space. It's version 0.0.1. When you're feeling better about everything, maybe you want to make that 1.0.0. And then the display name. Now you can leave it just like this. If you're only supporting one language, you can just enter it right here and say, okay, in this case, hello world, but you'll say it's a display name key. So if you are using resx files and you point to them down here, like this shows, then you would define the key inside that resx file for the string that you're looking up. So it might be a control name or something like that. And then in the resx files, you define hello world and all the different languages they might support. But we'll just keep this right like this for now. So we have hello world description, and the control type right now is standard. Right now, there's only one control type that is supported, that is available for you to use, and that's standard controls. So leave that as standard. That will probably change in the future. When? I don't know, but for now, standard is the way to go. And underneath, inside the control element, we have a bunch of different properties that we can define. Now, in this, for our demo here today, we're not going to just stick with simple property. We'll just call this name, and we'll do the same for the display name. We'll call it name. For the description, I'll say it's the name. Great. I am terrible with descriptions. Hey, I'm a developer. So then now moving on to this bottom line, this is kind of a little more interesting. We have of type. So this is going to be all the different types that that we support, which is going to be a lot of the kind of the normal stuff, whether it's a single line of text, whether it's multiple lines, whether it's a whole number or a floating point and so on. This is where you define it. For Canvas apps, it matters in where you're defining what the type is for that you'd expect, but it doesn't keep somebody from putting in some other version and really just get an error, I think, in the app itself. But in model-driven Power Apps, when you try to bind the control, it'll actually narrow down which components you can assign to a field based on the type of that field. So if the type of the field is a string, like it's the name and account or something, it'll only let you bind PCF components that have that string available to it. So in this case, we'll leave this, it says single line text, but you can also, and this is what this comment is getting down here below, is I'll define a type group. So in this case, if we wanted just a number, and we didn't really care what kind of a number, it could be a whole number, it could be a currency, floating point, decimal, it doesn't really matter. We just want a number. Instead of type, we would say of type group, and then we would point that to numbers and uncomment that, and that way we could bind to any of those sorts of things. But I'm not doing that today. We're going to stick with single line text, and so we'll just remove that for now. In our resources, we have our code path to our first file, index.ts. It's an order of 1, and you don't have to define every single code file you include inside your PCF component. We will walk the dependency tree starting with the files that you list here. So if index imports a few other things at the top and refers to other files, it'll automatically pull those in. It uses Webpack to walk that tree and do the compilation, so it'll find those. But the order is the loading order. So if you have maybe CSS or other resources you want to make sure are loaded before you run your code for whatever reason, make sure you set up this order appropriately. Otherwise, you can leave it all as 1, and that'll tell us you don't really care what order it's in. But we don't have any CSS or resx files today, so we'll hide that. And down here, there's some feature usage. So if in your Power App, in your control, you want to get location information as part of your control, or if you want to ask for a file or use the camera or any of that good kind of little deeper functionality inside the device, you have to define it inside here, or when it comes time to use it, it won't be available to you. So keep that in mind as you're working. But we're not doing that here as well. And all right, so a much simpler file, pretty ready to go. So I will hit Control S to save that. So now I'm gonna open up the terminal down here at the bottom so I don't have to keep bouncing back and forth. And I'm going to run npm run build. Now, don't put an extra slash at the end. All right, so that'll build the application, but what it's doing is, what I'm looking for is those first steps where it's validating the XML, and it's going to build TypeScript types based on the XML description that we've given. So we've seen that the types are already generated, it's compiling, good to go. So we'll close that and we'll look inside the generated types. And I'll just drag it down here so we can see both. All right, so we can see that we have our name input and our name output based on a string property where we're outputting it as just a string, and that's pulling from here. We get both inputs and outputs because our usage was said, we said it was bound. So you can have properties that are only inputs and properties that are only outputs. That's certainly a valid way to go. And that'll put them in here either on one side or the other. So as you're writing your code, you don't need to deal with XML. You don't have to remember the name of the properties, but in here, when we generate them, we'll put them right here inside these types. So it'll just show up with IntelliSense as you're writing, which is pretty good. All right, so let's get into the actual code of it itself. So PCF, it is a standard control as we talked about, has a few different methods, I should say, that you can fill out. First is a constructor. This you want to leave empty. You don't actually know when this code is going to run, when we might first instantiate this code. So we can't guarantee you a particular time when this constructor is run, so you don't want to put anything in here. Any constructor, any kind of setup logic for your component, you want to put inside a init. And let me put everything on one line here. Okay. Init is going to be the first thing that runs, and we're going to pass you a bunch of stuff about what's going on when we load your component. So we're going to give you your context. That's everything about the application you're running in, the user, what their situation is, what things are available to you, and the API surface for the framework is all going to be through context. Now, notify output changed is a callback that we give you. You're going to want to hold on to that so that you can define so for the framework that, okay, one of your outputs is changed, so you call notify output change to let the host application know, okay, grab this piece of data, it's time to do something with it. We have a state bag that if you want to maintain state across different controls, different loads, you can use that. And then we give you a container, which in this case is just the div. It's the empty web rectangle that you're filling with your application. So what I will do is I always hold on to two things. I will say this context equals context, and I'll say this dot container equals container, and last but not least, this dot NOC equals notify output change. Now it's complaining because I haven't defined those, so we'll just do that real quick. Up here at the top, and we get all the types that come along with it, which is good. All right, so that's all we're going to do in init. And down here in update view, this is where we're going to actually maybe draw our UI. So first things first, we'll just do just a real simple hello world. So we'll just say this dot the container inner text equals hello world. All right, and we're done. There are a couple more functions down here. There's one, get outputs. If you make a change to your outputs and you call notify output changed, that tells the framework we're ready. The framework turns around and calls get output. So you would define the outputs for your your output properties. So you can say name is whatever. Hopefully you're tracking it with some sort of internal variable. I'm not going to do that right now. And then last but not least is destroy. It's going to be the last thing we run. Think of it as the kind of the bookend for init. So this is where you're going to clean up any open network calls. You're going to clean up any event handlers and so on right here inside destroy. So hello world written. I will hit save and I'll pop open the terminal one more time to run our debug harness to see if it actually works. So I will say npm run watch, you can say npm run start. That'll start that debug harness, but it's super more useful if you say npm run watch. That'll put the harness inside watch mode so we can make changes here and have it automatically refresh. Oh, and I do that every time. npm start watch. Sorry about that. I think I must have done npm run back when I started learning npm, and it's just stuck in my brain now. All right, so we have the debug harness. It's run. It's running on localhost at 127.0.0.1. And hello world, we did it. You can set your width and height. So if you want to be maybe 200 by 200, you can see we get that box now. And we do have a name. It has a value, val. And if we type in here, nothing happens because we haven't written any code for that. So let's switch back to Visual Studio Code and use it. So back inside here, I'll just bring this down so we can see it more. We just said hello world. So instead of hello world, maybe we say hello, whatever your name is. So every time that value changes as an input, we're going to call update view. If something else happens inside the environment that we think you might want to re-render for, if somebody made the window bigger or smaller, or the underlying data that you're bound to has changed, we're going to call update views. This is your chance to change your UI based on some of those external inputs. In this case, we're going to change based on the fact that we have a new name. So we're going to say hello, and we got context dot parameters dot name, and you'd think that would be it, but name is actually, if I highlight that, we can see it's still that string property. It's not the actual value. It's stuff about the string. So you can get some more of the attributes. You can get a formatted version. So if you're talking about currency, it might be formatted. The security around it, you can get the type. But what we're looking for is just the raw value here. So that's what we'll use, and that is just a plain old string or null if there's nothing to find. So we'll just say that and keep the exclamation point because we're super excited. Okay, so every time we change a name, we should rerun this and reset that and be good to go. So I will save that, and we see that change is detected. And if we switch back to that window, we can see it's already updated to, hey, hello ASDF. So we can say, hello ESP or whatever else. And you can see as I'm typing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's updating, it's doing that loop. And one more thing that I want to point out before we move on is that if I open up the dev tools for this window, and if I attach it so that you can see it too, just drag this over. So this is just our browser development tools. I'm using the Edge browser based on Chromium. So if it looks like Chrome, it kind of is. And if we look inside the sources, we can have all the code for the debug harness itself and so on. But this PCF tools underscore big long number, that's going to be your code. So let's expand that out. We see index.ts. We can click on that. And down here, we have our code that we were just writing, and I can set a breakpoint. And now if I come back in here and hit, say, the 7, we see that breakpoint is run. We have our context. We have our name object with everything going on in there, just the raw value. We have our container. It's all the basic debugger stuff that you'd expect inside web development right here in the browser. Debugging, everything just works. And that's PCF, really, in a nutshell.